everyone. Happy Thursday. Welcome to OsteoBites. Thank you for joining us at our special time this week, a little bit earlier than normal. My name is Christina Itoma, and I am mom to Osteo Angel Dillon and Director of Scientific Programs at MIB Agents. And today on OsteoBites, we are talking with Dr. Nathalie Gaspar about the phase 1-2 study of single-agent Lenvatinib in children and adolescents with refractory or relapsed solid malignancies and young adults with osteosarcoma. Thank you so much, Dr. Gaspar, for joining us on OsteoBites today. We are thrilled to have you. And thank you to Shannon for joining us as our panelist today. Shannon is sister to Osteo Angel Dillon, and a different Dillon. And we are very lucky to also have her on our MIB Agents Junior Advisory Board. Before we start, a little bit about our guest today. Dr. Gaspar is a pediatric oncologist at Gustave Roussy Cancer Campus in Villejuif, France. She is the head of the adolescent and young adult unit and chair of the AYA program at the Institute. She's in charge of bone sarcomas, cancers with peak incidence in the AYA population, from biology to clinical care. She is also the pediatric head of the French Bone Adult and Pediatric Sarcoma group, GROUPOS, and she's actively involved in early new drug development in France and Europe through her participation on the clinical trial committee of the Innovative Therapeutics for Child and Adolescent with Cancer Consortium, and through her action as co-chair of fostering age-inclusive research, known as the FAIR Trial initiative of the multi-stakeholder Accelerate platform. And she's also working on a new initiative called FOSTER, Fight Osteosarcoma Through European Research, as the consortium of doctors and patient advocates to improve the outcome of osteosarcoma patients in terms of duration and quality of life of survivors. Welcome, Dr. Gaspar, and welcome to everyone joining us today. Please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A, and we'll make sure to ask Dr. Gaspar. And before we get started, just a couple of announcements. We launched our monthly newsletter, Connective Issue, yesterday. It includes info of interest to our osteosarcoma community, including recent news and papers, open clinical trials, job postings even, info about MIB events and programs, and spotlights on members of our community. And so to make sure you get all this info delivered in your mailbox each month, just go to our website and hit the Join Our Community button to subscribe. And we're still in September, Childhood Cancer Awareness Month, so you still can outrun osteosarcoma with us. I will put the link in the chat where you can sign up to do that. You can even do it virtually with a friend across the country, somewhere else across the world even. So that might be a fun activity you can still do in September. And we are still making and selling our gold bows, and so it's not too late to order a bow, and we'll put a link in the chat for that as well. And we'd like to thank the sponsor of our episode, the Osteosarcoma Institute, a nonprofit organization led by osteosarcoma experts from top US cancer centers who together are concentrating on the cure for osteosarcoma. The mission of the OSI is to dramatically increase treatment options and survival rates in osteosarcoma patients through identifying and funding the most promising and breakthrough osteosarcoma clinical trials and science. And in addition to advancing research, OSI also provides a free resource called OSI Connect for osteosarcoma patients. Their osteosarcoma experts can discuss available treatments, possible side effects, and provide helpful advice for getting the most out of your visits with your treating physician. This resource is available in English and Spanish and aims to help patients and families find answers to those questions. So thank you, OSI, for sponsoring this episode. And Shannon, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, my name is Shannon McCormack. I'm very excited to be here today. I am 19 years old. I am a second-time junior board member, and I am also, like Christina said, an osteo sibling to an Osteo Angel, my brother Dylan. And now I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Gaspar.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. I apologize already for my English that is not as good as yours. Then do not hesitate to interrupt me, to ask questions during the talk. It will probably not last 40 minutes, but anyway, if you have any question, please feel free to do it. I will talk to you about the phase 1-2 Lenvatinib in refractory and relapsed osteosarcoma. And this molecule is part of the family of the multi-kinase inhibitor, that have been developed a long time ago in osteosarcoma, with the first study with the sorafenib already more than 15 years ago. Since then, several of these molecules have been developed in osteosarcoma, and what we have seen is a class effect of these drugs in osteosarcoma. The Lenvatinib story has started with a collaboration between Gustave Roussy and ESAI and the European consortium that is called ITCC, for Innovative Therapeutics for Child with Cancer, which is a European consortium that develops phase 1 in children with any cancer. I think it's a good example on how academic and industry can collaborate together, because the industry came to us to fill up a pediatric investigation plan, which is a regulatory requirement in Europe. But this real collaboration has helped us to do what we wanted to do as an academic in osteosarcoma. The study started with a phase 1 as single agent, and the second part of the study was a combination with the chemotherapy. Then there are 2 papers that have been published from this study, the single agent experience in osteosarcoma mainly, and the combination experience with chemotherapy in osteosarcoma, all in the relapse setting. Then I will present you both paper because it's the same story. The first part of the study was then a classical phase 1 to try to find the recommended dose of Lenvatinib in children, while at that time the recommended dose was known in adults, but not in children. Then the first part was a phase 1 with single agent, and the second part was a phase 1b and a phase 2 with single agent, with a combination with Lenvatinib and chemotherapy. For the phase 1, then, as I said, the recommended dose was not known for children, but already known for adults. Then we started to test the dose at 80% of the adult dose, and we increased the dose progressively. As the pediatric population has never used this treatment, they have the European Medical Agency as a special requirement for the youngest patient that were younger than 6 years old, because they were fearing to digestive complication, and they asked us to start with a very low dose in this patient to avoid any problem. We had no problem, and we were able to increase the dose for those children at the same level than the other ones. At that time, all type of tumor could be included. Then there were at that time very few osteosarcoma and mainly other type of sarcomas and neuroblastoma. 23 patients were included, all very heavily pretreated before starting the study, and most of them with progressive disease. We started at 11 milligram per meter square, and we were able to go up to 17 milligram per meter square. And we experienced 3 dose-limiting toxicity at 14 milligram per meter square, but 2 of these patients were initially at 17, and we have to decrease the dose at 14. And these dose-limiting toxicity were hypertension, arterial hypertension, which is a known effect of all multi-kinase inhibitors, and liver toxicity. Then the recommended dose in that population, pediatric population, is 14 milligram per meter square per day, which is equivalent to the adult dose, but the adult dose is not calculated with the body surface area, but is a fixed dose at 24 milligram per day. But it's equivalent if you calculate it with the surface, body surface area.
And Dr. Gaspar, could you talk a little bit about the requirements or the kind of eligibility of the patients on the trial? Had they all had been pre-treated with chemo and just kind of what the washout period might have been? And then also, did they have, was this kind of when they were no evidence of disease, or did all these patients have as like a maintenance therapy, or did they all have visible disease? And was there any kind of like requirements on kind of how much disease, like how bulky the disease was?
For this first phase, all solid malignancy were included, just relapse and refractory. Then all these patients had received chemotherapy before the standard treatment for chemotherapy. And as they are heavily pretreated patients, most of them have got more than 3 lines of chemotherapy before starting this disease. And the age was 2 to 18, and we were able to include not just measurable disease according to RECIST criteria, but also patients with available disease. But you have to add, you need to have disease present at that time. It was not an adjuvant treatment after being in complete remission of a relapse.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you.
Most of these patients have side effects, not important side effects, but some of them were needed in temporary interruption of few days of the treatment, and some of them have required dose reduction. And as it's a phase 1, this part is a phase 1, there were no the efficacy evaluation were a secondary objective and not a primary objective. The primary objective was the tolerance and the definition of the recommended dose. But we look at the efficacy, and what we have seen is mainly stabilization of the disease, whatever the disease. Once this phase 1 was done and those recommended defined, we expanded the trial with other disease to try to look this time at the efficacy in a phase 2 expansion cohort. We were required by the EMA to test that in a very specific disease, which is thyroid cancer, because at that time the indication in adults for the Lenvatinib was thyroid. We told them that it was not feasible in children because it's a disease that is very rare, and that we were more interested in osteosarcoma. Then they allowed us to do cohort with osteosarcoma and cohort with thyroid cancer. As expected, we did not recruit patients in the thyroid cancer, and we had only 1 patient that were from the United States. We recruited all the patients that we needed to do the phase 2 study in osteosarcoma. At that time, we increased the age of inclusion up to 25, because osteosarcoma is an adolescent and young adult disease, and to be in agreement with the FAIR for IR Accelerate initiative. FAIR is for Fostering Age-Inclusive Research, where we try to avoid the 18 years barriers in the trials when it's not justified. We increased the age in that trial up to 25. And that was with the help of the pharma industry, SI, and the help of the EMA. The primary endpoint in that study was efficacy, and especially the progression-free survival rate at 4 months. In terms of population, we included 31 patients. Most of them were adolescents with a median age of 15 years. And we had children from 9 and up to 22 years, and young adults up to 22 years. Again, very heavily pretreated patients. Most of them all of them have received chemotherapy, and all of them have received the 3 major drugs that are used in osteosarcoma, which are methotrexate, doxorubicin, and cisplatin. And most of them have also received ifosfamide and etoposide. than very heavily pretreated patients. And most of these patients at the time of inclusion had a very progressive disease. In terms of efficacy, what we have seen is mainly stable disease. 13 of these patients have stable disease. We had 2 partial response. 1 patient that have a tumor shrinkage of more than 35% at 8 weeks and was still with response at 5 months, or 4 to 6 months, 4.6 months. And the second patient have a 60% tumor shrinkage at 12 weeks and was still with response at the date of cutoff. Then means that we can have a very interesting response, even if it's not a lot of patients, and stabilizing disease in osteosarcoma can already be a very good response, because some of them, because of the calcification of the tumor, will not shrink, whatever the treatment that you do. The PFS4 was interesting, 29% when you use the bimodal estimate, and nearly 40% when you use the Kaplan-Meier estimate, which is close from what was observed with older multi-kinase inhibitor. Most of them has received the dose that they were supposed to receive, but there were some dose interruption due to toxicity, and usually no more than 9 days. But one of them has got a very long, prolonged interruption, but probably not due to the drug, but due to the disease itself. Drug reduction was also observed in a third of the patient. And usually that occurs during the first 2 cycles. And then once you have found the dose that is well tolerated by the patient, the dose can be maintained a long time. As I said, the results in terms of efficacy are comparable to the other trials that have been run during the same times with sorafenib, regorafenib, or cabozantinib, or apatinib. In terms of toxicity profile, the main side effect that was observed was hypothyroidism. That's where my English is not good, sorry. Problem of the thyroid, which is not a big problem for the patient, because usually it's an abnormality that you can detect on the blood tests without clinical symptoms, and you can have a hormonal supplementation, and then the patient can feel nothing about this side effect. The other side effects were decrease of appetite, hypertension, which is something that is usual with that kind of class of drug, but were less frequent than what is seen in adults. One side effect that was very specific to osteosarcoma, that can be seen with a lot of them in other disease, but were a little bit more frequent in osteosarcoma, were the occurrence of pneumothorax, especially when the metastases were necrotic under treatment. Then some spontaneous pneumothorax could appear, usually asymptomatic and without major problem for the patient, but some of the patients has got to have a physical intervention to solve the pneumothorax. And this has linked to dose modification, dose reduction especially, and one patient has got to discontinue the treatment. We look also for the pharmacokinetic of the lenvatinib in children compared to adults, and as the recommended dose is the same in children and in adults, the PK is the same in children and in adults, which confirm the fact the initiative of the Accelerate FAIR trial, saying that we should include all the adolescents from 12 years old in adults trial when it's medically justified, which is also something that if the FDA has bring and highlighted a lot in the last years. That was for the single agent. And then we thought that it will be interesting to combine this drug with chemotherapy that is used usually in first relapse in osteosarcoma, which is ifosfamide plus etoposide. Then we, again, we did a phase 1b, meaning that we look for the recommended dose of the lenvatinib associated this time with the chemotherapy. We were favoring some cumulative toxicity, especially on the kidney, because ifosfamide can be responsible of tubulopathy, which is a kind of toxicity of the kidney. And lenvatinib can give proteinuria. Then we were a little bit worried about the cross toxicity that can occur with this association. Again, we use osteosarcoma up to, we propose this trial to patients with osteosarcoma, relapsed and refractory, and up to 25 years old. And again, we included not just measurable disease according to RECIST, but also evaluable disease, and no more than 2 prior treatment with VEGF targeted therapy were accepted. The primary endpoint was again PFS 4 months. I cannot show you exactly all the data, but the rationale of that was sustained also by preclinical work that was done in vitro, but also in vivo, with a synergistic effect of the lenvatinib associated with ifosfamide. The population of that part of the study were mostly adolescent and young adults. Most of the patients had more than 12 years old, up to 22 in that one. Most of them have lung metastases as main localization of the disease, but some of them have also bone metastases. They were, again, heavily pretreated. Most of them have got at least 2 or 3 lines of treatment before entering the trial. All of them have received doxorubicin, and most of them have also received ifosfamide and plus or minus etoposide before entering the trial. And most of them have a progressive disease at the trial entry. 22 patients were treated in the phase 1b with 6 dose-limiting toxicity that appears in 3 patients. 1 thrombopenia, grade 3, that was due to the chemotherapy rather than the lenvatinib. Oral dysesthesia and lower back pain and muscle spasm. Dysesthesia and muscle spasms are something that can be seen also due to the previous chemotherapy that patients have received. And the third patient has thrombopenia and epistaxis due to the thrombopenia. Again, we did a dose escalation. We tested the drug at 11 milligrams per meter square, below the recommended dose as single agent, and then we increased to 14. And what is important is that the recommended dose of the lenvatinib associated with etoposide and fosfamide was the same than the recommended dose as single agent, and the dose was 14 milligrams per meter square and per day.
Did you notice, Dr. Gaspar, for the toxicities, was it different in the patients that had been already treated with IE and we're getting more IE?
Yeah, we didn't look in detail to that because the number of patients is not enough to really make an assumption on that.
Right.
But there is a risk that if you have already received ifosfamide, when you receive more ifosfamide, to have more risk in, at the kidney, in terms of kidney toxicity. But we didn't see any unexpected toxicity in that trial. Okay. We looked to the efficacy, and to look at the efficacy, we look at all the patients that have received the recommended dose in the escalation phase, but also in the expansion cohort. Then instead of looking only to the 20 patients of the expansion cohort, we had 35 patients that were all treated at the recommended dose that were evaluated for the response to the combination Lenvatinib and ifosfamide etoposide. In terms of toxicity, there were no grade 5. There were grade 3 and grade 4 that were mainly due to the toxicity expected with the chemotherapy. And most of the Lenvatinib toxicity were usually grade 2 and manageable with dose reduction in 60% of the case and temporary interruption in half of the patients. The main toxicity of Lenvatinib was again hypothyroidism. We'll never be able to say it properly. Proteinuria and hypertension, but as you've seen, it was not a lot of patients. Most of that were grade 2 and very few with grade 3 that needed a real intervention. And again, around 10% of the patients experienced pneumothorax with the Lenvatinib combined with the chemotherapy.
You can. Sorry,
yes.
on the pneumothorax, is that something that is more common to Lenvatinib in general, or is it something that's pretty common across the pan TKIs like sorafenib and?
Is a problem of class of the class of the drug, not specifically of Lenvatinib, but all multi-kinase inhibitor, Lenvatinib, regorafenib, cabozantinib, all the ones that have been tested can be responsible of pneumothorax, but it's probably more frequent in patients with osteosarcoma with lung metastasis than in other cancer with lung metastasis. Because if you look to the study that have been done in adults, where there were mostly carcinomas, the incidence of pneumothorax under multi-kinase inhibitor is much more lower. Then that's something probably due to the biology of osteosarcoma in general associated with these multi-kinase inhibitors.
Got it. Thank you.
Then in terms of efficacy, this combination has been able to stabilize the disease for 19 of the patients, and 3 patients as a partial response. You can see here 2 examples. This is one patient with one lung metastasis here that has decreased over time. Here it says 8 weeks. And another one with a lung metastasis close to the heart that has also decreased, less impressively, but still something that is very appreciable when you have an osteosarcoma in relapse. In terms of PFS at 4 months, with bimodal estimate, it was 50%, 80% with the Kaplan-Meier, with a median PFS of 8.7 months, again comparable to the other multi-kinase inhibitor that have been used in osteosarcoma, and comparable with what is used in chemotherapy. Lenvatinib was the only one that was combined with that kind of chemotherapy in osteosarcoma. In terms of overall survival, it was also quite important for relapsed osteosarcoma. You were asking if the toxicity was different when you have the chemotherapy or not. I could not answer to that question, but we look to the fact that we look to the efficacy according to the fact that the patient has received in previous treatments ifosfamide and etoposide, and we did not see difference for those that have received them the chemotherapy, this kind of chemotherapy before, and those that have not received it. Then that's the study how it is, and to answer some of your questions, what we need now is a randomized trial. A randomized trial randomizing the chemotherapy alone versus the chemotherapy plus the Lenvatinib to really see if the lenvatinib is adding more efficacy to the chemotherapy or not, and also to see if there is differences in terms of toxicity. Then we will be able to differentiate what is the toxicity of the chemotherapy alone and what is the toxicity of the chemotherapy plus the lenvatinib. Then this trial has been run and is closed on the 19th of November 2021. We are expecting the full result of this study before the end of the year. And the study was randomizing 4 courses of ifosfamide in first relapse this time, not to try to have patients that were not too heavily pretreated, then in first relapse, and 5 courses of ifosfamide etoposide plus lenvatinib. For the patients that had received only chemotherapy, when they progressed of the disease, they were allowed to have a crossover to be able to receive the lenvatinib at the time of progression, either lenvatinib alone or lenvatinib plus etoposide ifosfamide, depending on when they have progressed. If they have progressed very early, then you are able to add the lenvatinib with the chemotherapy. When they have progressed later on, then you were adding just the lenvatinib alone. Maybe I will not go to the detail of the endpoints, but we changed the endpoint not just for PFS 4 months, but for the PFS in general, to be able to also operate the patients, because we know that it's very important to operate patients with osteosarcoma when it's feasible. Then we were including patients with evaluable and measurable disease, and if after the PFS, after the chemotherapy, the patient was operable, it was allowed to be operated. There are also some pharmacokinetic, quality of life and safety endpoints in the study as secondary endpoints. Multi-kinase inhibitor in osteosarcoma is a very important subject that has been discussed extensively in the Accelerate forum. Then, as we mentioned at the beginning, Accelerate is a platform that was initially European, but now that is all over the world, with academic, with pharma industry, with regulators from the EMA, from the FDA, where we discuss all together during this forum of a topic, and we come up to a consensus on what should be done in the future. Then the paper on the forum on multi-kinase inhibitor in bone sarcoma, either osteosarcoma and Ewing sarcoma, has been published very recently. You can find the paper here. Now what we are trying to understand, we have developed multi-kinase inhibitors in relapsed osteosarcoma. And now what we are trying to understand is how to introduce them in first-line treatment for osteosarcoma. And this is also a discussion that is done in the Foster Consortium. Then Foster Consortium is a new consortium, European consortium, and Foster is for Fight Osteosarcoma through European Research. I'm chairing this consortium, and Emanuela Palmerini, which is a medical oncologist, is the co-chair. We have already 19 countries and more than 200 members that are participating to this consortium with different work packages, and the final objective is really to improve the survival of osteosarcoma patients. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gaspar, and everyone, please feel free if you have questions to put them in the Q&A, and we will make sure to ask. So first of all, really encouraging results, particularly even just as certainly as a combination therapy, but even as single agent. And I was also, looking at a couple of results where I think there were 2 patients in particular who had really good tumor shrinkage in the phase 2. And I'm wondering if you have been able to do any correlative studies to determine kind of what that molecular profile is of those patients to just see, what do the responders look like?
Not yet. There are samples that have been collected. Then this is a very important topic to try to understand why there are some patients that are responding and not others, to try to see also how to develop these drugs. This was a very important topic of the Accelerate Forum on multi-kinase inhibitor in bone osteosarcoma. And one of the conclusions of this forum is that we need to put all together what we have available from the academic and from the industry trials, all the samples, and try to answer this question, not individually trial per trial, but all together. Then that will be an action point from the next year. And what is planned is to have a follow-up meeting of this Accelerate meeting, normally 1 year after the first one, to see if things have moved on and if we have been able to put together all this information that might exist but have not been exploited yet.
Yes, because even I think you had one slide up that had some of the different, the other multi-TKIs like pazopanib and even like a newer one, Cabo, and it'd just be interesting because it's hard, since they are pan inhibitors, it's kind of difficult to figure out which one to choose, right? Because they all seem to kind of hit similar targets. And so just curious, it would be really, great, obviously, to have that data about kind of what the responders look like for each of those drugs.
Yeah, exactly. It's very important to understand because, as you said, they are very broad inhibitors. And what is really the important thing is very difficult to say. But osteosarcoma is also a very complex tumor with a very complex genetic. And maybe what is important for osteosarcoma is to target multiple things and not just one. Then it's important to try to understand, but there is an efficacy seen objective with all this class of drug, and we should not wait to have the answer from the biology before moving forward for the patient.
Mm-hmm. And so a few more questions related to that, because I know, and actually, I mean, I have kind of personal experiences with Dylan, but what are your thoughts on TKIs as more of a maintenance therapy for high-risk patients? Because, and I don't know if this is the right way to think about it, but when I think about, chemo versus the TKIs, I think of chemo as you're kind of actively killing the cells, whereas the TKIs seem like they're better at slowing or preventing growth, so that if you have bulky disease, it's it's harder to tackle it, right, with just a TKI. I don't know if that's the right way to think about it, but that's kind of how I think about it. Yeah. And so it seems like, especially if a patient is already kind of in a high risk bucket, high risk group, it might be effective to kind of put them on a TKI when there's no visible disease, but that they may have a high risk of relapse. So chemo, surgery, and then maintenance with a TKI. What are your thoughts on that, and potentially being able to, I don't know if there's a way to trial that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And we have currently in France 2 trials testing this hypothesis. One trial that is the Relapsed study, where you receive the first-line treatment of osteosarcoma with chemo and surgery. And at the end of this first-line treatment, if you are in complete remission, whatever your risk factor at the beginning, you are randomized between placebo and regorafenib. Then that is asking the question of maintenance in all the patients with osteosarcoma. And there is another trial, which is the REGOMAIN trial, which is asking the same question, but for these patients that are in minimal residual disease, but not completely free of the disease, where there are some disease remaining and that cannot be removed. Then that's the second trial. Then this question is already being asked in 2 trials in France.
That'll be really interesting to see. and also just thoughts on resistance, because I think that sometimes can be an issue with the TKIs, is that they may actually be effective for a period, but at some point cancer just figures out a way to still get around it. And just thoughts also on potentially sequencing, if there's like just strategies, I guess, for kind of being even smarter than the chemo and smarter than the cancer cells in developing resistance, like potentially like sequencing of TKIs, if they are in.
For my knowledge, there is no trial as such now, but when we were running the Lenvatinib study in France, the Regorafenib study in France, which was called Regostar, Regobone, sorry, and the cabozantinib trial, which was called Cabone in France, we were running the 3 trials at the same time. And the Regobone trial was usually used for first relapse or second relapse, and the cabozantinib trial could be used after the Regobone trial. Then we have already, even if it's not a proper trial experience with a trial testing the sequence, we already have some experience of sequential treatment with multi-kinase inhibitors. And there are some response that can be observed with a second multi-kinase inhibitor, even if you have progressed with the first one. But we still don't know which are the important things. Then the biology will be also important to understand what kind of resistance can be developed under this kind of treatment.
Dr. Gaspar, would there be a possibility of combining TKIs with immunotherapy? Has that ever been looked into?
Yeah, there are already trials that are existing, combining both. It has been tested in different kind of tumors, but in osteosarcoma there is also a trial that is ongoing in France, where you use a PD-1 inhibitor with the cabozantinib. The only problem of that trial is that for the moment it's just open for adults and not for pediatric population. Then we are trying to work on that with the lab, with the pharma, to try to decrease the age of the trial.
And also, are most of the Europe researchers listing their research in the NIH trials database? And how do you all share your research information in Europe to coordinate?
In terms of, how can I say that? In the FOSTER, the consortium FOSTER is trying to tackle this problem, because Europe is not like the United States. You are one country, even if you have different states, you're one country and you are able to centralize a lot of things through your society. In Europe, we are different countries. We are doing things not exactly the same, and we are running different trials in different countries. Then what we are trying with the FOSTER consortium is bring all this information together to try to have a more broader overview and to be able to compare things also between trials. And there is a huge work, but not just for Europe, but for across the world, to try to define how should we design a trial to be able to answer properly the question that we want to ask with new drugs, and to be able to compare the data between trials. It's not a proper way of doing it, but instead of multiplying very expensive trials, sometimes just comparing what exists already is important. But for that, we need to do the things, we need to do things in the same way. If we have very different designs, very different primary endpoints, it's very difficult to compare. We have done a review a few years ago, and none of the trials have the same endpoints. none of the trial have the same hypothesis. It's very difficult to try to extract data from that. There have been a US paper from LACME try to standardize things, but it's not admitted all across the world. Then I think there is more work to do on that. Also, trial design is also very important to try to move on the research.
And just kind of related to that, I know, and I don't know if it was part of the same trial or partnership with the same pharma company, but I know there were trials in the US with Lenvatinib, with IE as well. And I'm curious if you're able to, maybe it's the same thing where it can't compare, it's apples to oranges, but are you able to leverage the data from that trial to?
Yeah, the trial that was open in the US with Lenvatinib in IE is the only trial, is the randomized trial that I told you at the end.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That trial was open in all the countries. Even if we have started the studies with Lenvatinib in Europe, the OLI trial was open in the United States, in Asia, all over the world. They have opened more than, I think, 80 centers all over the world to try to speed up the trial, offer it to a maximum of person, and to try to have the results as soon as possible.
Great. And I think that you were saying that the results might be available by the end of this year.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. Yeah, that will be really interesting to see. And I'm just curious, like as a patient or, family, if they are kind of looking at, options for choosing a TKI. I mean, I know you kind of want to go where there is some evidence, but given some of the options, and I even forgot about Refractory, their trials on all of these, like any advice for, and even for the treating oncologist, like given the selection of the MTKIs and having to choose one, how do you choose which one to?
Very difficult.
That's $1 million question. Yeah.
It depends if you're a very rich country or not. If you're a very rich country, you have the choice. You can choose the one that you think is the best and the best tolerated, the best in terms of efficacy, best of in terms of tolerance. There are some countries that have no choice because you cannot access all the multi-kinase inhibitors. If you look to the data, as I said, we cannot really compare them together, then it's difficult to know if there is one that is more efficient than the other one. But in terms of toxicity, they are not exactly the same. There are some of them that are less tolerated. Then you can start with one that you think is more tolerated and see how it is efficient. It's really a discussion on how the drug is available in your country, what is the toxicity that the patient can tolerate or not. And then sometimes you start with one and you go to another because the toxicity is too high for one. And the toxicity are not always cross toxicity. I told you about the thyroid, the hypertension, but there is also for some of them what we call hand and foot syndrome. Is that the English word? Yeah. And it's also very dependent of the patient. Then sometimes you just have to start with one and see how it goes and move to another one if it's not efficient enough or too toxic.
So I know you talked a little bit about the side effect of the MTKIs, but can you talk a little more on the side effects by just like the TKIs? Or
sorry, I did not understand.
Christina, do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Oh, yeah. So it does sound like there are some kind of common side effects across the MTKIs, but are there any side effects that are more pronounced for the different specific drugs? So kind of you had mentioned like it kind of depends on both availability as well as toxicities. maybe the toxicities are also different kind of on a specific patient level, but are there certain TKIs that have greater toxicity types of toxicities? And I know like some like pazopanib, for example, and sorafenib have been around longer, whereas like cabozantinib is a newer drug, and perhaps they've been able to reduce some of those toxicities. I don't know, but
yeah, basically they all have the same kind of toxicity. Clearly the sorafenib, which is the old one, is less tolerated than the new ones. And among the new ones, there are some that are giving more hand and foot syndromes, other that are giving more gut syndrome, vomiting, or and abdominal pain. Sorry for the English. Abdominal pain or weight loss. Then it's not a specific toxicity, but more some that are a little bit more toxic in one of the toxicity that is known for all of them.
Got it. And is there particularly for, I mean, I know the hand and foot syndrome for sure, and but the pneumothorax in particular, because, you know, again, maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, I think people were not as familiar with what some of these side effects were. And so you'd see something in a scan and there'd be like, is that caused? It was unclear if that was caused by the TKI. It actually seems there's been some progress in the last few years where, you know, it seems expected, like, oh, okay, we see pneumothorax, that is likely a result of the TKI. And so with the kind of the experience that we've had in the past few years with these trials, which have been great, and other trials, is there a collection somewhere, perhaps in Europe or globally would be even better, about kind of like, okay, so now that we see more patients using TKIs, these are kind of the expected side effects and also management guidelines for even just like monitoring the pneumothorax, or you know, I think we're pretty, I think generally now they bring in like the dermatologists, you know, to help kind of manage the hand and foot syndrome, but just I guess collective information on what side effects to expect and how to manage those.
I'm not sure that we have that in place. What exists, what we did in France, we opened a trial that is called SPIAJA, where we collect all the toxicity of the efficacy of all the drugs that are given outside trials to children. And for example, since the trials have closed, and when you treat a patient with osteosarcoma with a multi-kinase inhibitor, they can be included in that trial. In that trial, you collect all this data to try to see what is it in real life for the patient. We are trying to expand this SPIAJA trial across Europe, to not be just a French trial, but to be something that is for all the European patients, to try to get more information. And with this information, maybe we will be able to do guidelines. But up to now, to my knowledge, there is local guidelines, but no global guidelines for that.
Mm-hmm. I know though that that Europe participates in the Pediatric Cancer Data Commons, which, if I understand correctly, all that the trial data would be collected there.
Yeah.
Conceivably, you could go in and look up patients that received lenvatinib.
Yeah, exactly. For the moment, then that's the Hibiscus project, which is led in US, but all the countries in US and in Europe are participating to that. Where it's part of a bigger project from the University of Chicago of Pediatric Data Commons for all pediatric cancer. But for the moment, this is a project that is starting. And the data that will be put first in that project will be the trials that are already closed, and then mainly trials that are where patients have received chemotherapy and first-line trials. Then maybe at some point we will be able to do the same with the relapsed trials and with the new trials that are coming up, but it will not be very soon, I think.
Yeah, but it's good to plant those seeds now, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is in general something that is very important in pediatric oncology, is the will of the pediatric oncologist to put the data together to be able to understand better things and to get quicker experience.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gaspar. That was really interesting. I'm so glad that you were able to join us. I know it's a little later in the day for you, so appreciate your making the time and for making it better for osteosarcoma patients everywhere. More information on this episode and all OsteoBites can be found on YouTube, on our website at mibagents.org, and at your favorite podcast place. And please join us next week on OsteoBites, Thursday, 9:15 at our regular time, 3 p.m. Eastern. We will have Dr. Nancy Klauber-Demore. She is a surgical oncologist at the Medical University of South Carolina, and she's going to be talking about her work on overcoming PD-1 inhibitor resistance with a monoclonal antibody to secreted frizzled-related protein 2 in metastatic osteosarcoma. And you can find the rest of our lineup for 2022 on our website. If you have any future topics you'd like to hear about, please share them with us. I just dropped an email address in the chat. Thank you again so much, Dr. Gaspar and Shannon, for spending an hour with us today, and to our sponsor, the Osteosarcoma Institute. And thank you for joining us today on OsteoBites. We hope to see you next week.